All right. Welcome, everyone, to the Institute of Historical Research Food History Seminar. And this food history seminar provides an inclusive setting in which food historians and academics and experts working in the fields can come together to discuss our research. I am Brandy Simpson-Miller. I studied the food history of West Africa, Ghana specifically, from the 17th century onward. I had to think about that. I'm currently working in the United States at Wesleyan Women's College, and where I teach history. And with us today is our founding member, our convener, Kelly Spring. Dr. Spring is a food studies entrepreneur, a researcher, a writer, and a lecturer, and her work examines the impact of international crises on domestic and global food systems. And her company, The Forkfront, offers services ranging from consulting and researching and writing about food history to creating curated food history narratives, courses, and menus. And I'm really excited about her book, Spam, A Global History. And there's Kelly, up, she's waving. Spam, A Global History with Reaction Press. It's coming out in 2025. I cannot wait for this book to come out. So, and then as our speaker today, we have Dr. Urszula Fliess. She's an associate professor of English studies at the John Paul II Catholic University of Lublin in Poland. And she's the author of 4 monographs devoted to the study of the U.S. South, and one of them, Live and Let Dine, Food and Race in the Texts of the American South, was awarded the 2018 American Studies Network Book Prize. And her recent book project, Race and Repast, Foodscapes in 20th Century Southern Literature, was published with the University of Arkansas Press in December of 2022. And her most recent book project, Pathologizing Black Bodies, The Legacy of Plantation Slavery, which she co-authored with Professor Iwa Luzak and Professor Constante Gonzalez Coroba, came out with Routledge in 2023. So we are most excited to have Dr. Fliess with us. And I think without further ado, if you'll unmute yourself and begin your presentation.
Good morning. Actually, good afternoon. So thank you so much for having me today and for finding time to listen to my research. So I will begin sharing the screen. This is not exactly what I wanted. This is the... And let me just... Okay. I have problems with the... Yes, good. So my talk today is devoted to food as a weapon of the week, and I'm going to use American slave narratives and WPA narratives as a source of historical knowledge of the way African slaves in southern colonies used food as a way of getting back or negotiating their position on plantations. So the year 2019 marked the 400th anniversary of the Anglo-centric enslavement of Africans within the USA. An estimated 400,000 captive Africans were brought to the British coastal colonies and later the USA from across the Atlantic through a journey that came to be called the Middle Passage. Charleston, South Carolina was the major port of entry, receiving up to 200,000 captured Africans. The ban on transatlantic slave trade, issued by the US Congress in January 1807, became effective in January 1808. At that time, 4 million enslaved Africans lived in the South. Slavery flourished in southern states despite the cessation of importing human chattel. Northern entrepreneurs, mostly from New York, continued to illegally traffic captive Africans through Spanish Florida well into 1860s, long after Florida had been ceded to the US in 1819. More than 8,000 smuggled captives were sold into bondage to southern plantations after 1807 ban and before the Civil War, which began in 1861. Since Africans were deemed legal chattel slavery, defined as property owned by an enslaver, their children were automatically born into slavery, thus enabling planters to reap profits from breeding and selling their own slaves. Although slavery was officially abolished, as I said earlier, in 1865, that was the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution, its influence continued in African culture and literature. There were fictional depictions of slavery that originated during the antebellum period, so that is before the Civil War. Sentimental novels were written within the Moonlight and Magnolia tradition, like romantic plantation novels, that defended slavery by glorifying plantation life. Some saw enslavement as a blessing for the enslaved. However, there were also fictional depictions of slavery that stressed the economic ineffectiveness and socially destructive impact of slavery on the fabric of American society. The late 18th century anti-slavery movement in the USA, precipitated by the humanitarian principles of the Enlightenment and the rise of sentimentalism, fostered public interest in autobiographical narratives written or dictated by ex-slaves of African descent. Abolitionists exploited this literary genre to advance the cause of ending slavery. In the 1830s and 1840s, slave narratives that I'm going to discuss today, slave narratives, and I lost my track. They were a popular means of graphically documenting the horrors of Southern chattel slavery, such as the rape of enslaved women or the heinous torture of enslaved men, as well as pointing out the hypocrisy of Southern religion, which allowed such atrocities to occur. These narratives not only provide accounts of conditions in which the enslaved lived, but also describe the ways slaves responded to and rebelled against their forced captivity. Many such narratives reference the role of food as a tool of resistance. Now, situating food in the oppression-resistance axis reveals how it functions rhetorically as well as materially as one of the weapons of the weak. So in my lecture today, the evidence from published slave narratives, the examples that you can see on the screen, and the Works Progress Administration, WPA, which was part of the Federal Writers Project, and these are the first-person accounts of life under slavery, they will serve as illustrative examples of non-insurrectionary forms of resistance in the Old South, hidden in foodways and foodscapes. Dozens of slave narratives and samples of several thousand WPA interviews recorded between 1920s and 1930s offer remarkably invariant examples of Black lives under the exigencies of chattel slavery in various Southern states. What is crucial in the text narratives and those transcribed testimonies as primary historical evidence is not the individual accounts of what happened, but rather the cumulative repetitiveness of the negotiations of Black subjectivity as depicted within those texts with the use of food. Now, who gets food, what kind, and how much speaks volumes about the power dynamics at play between enslaved people and their masters. It will be a mistake, however, to ascribe all the power in that relationship only to slave masters. As James Scott, a historian, points out in his classic study of rural conflict in Malaysia, these lacking sanctional institutional power are not powerless by any means. They possess what he calls weapons of the weak, which include evasion, pilfering, sabotage, deliberate delay, false compliance, or feigned ignorance. These, quote, require little or no coordination on planning. They often represent a form of individual self-help, and they typically avoid any direct symbolic confrontation with authority, unquote. So through the use of these tactics, enslaved Africans challenged the power of their masters without incurring unnecessary risk. Now, divide and govern was the most prevalent strategy planters implemented to control their human property, fostering division among bondsmen. And this was a kind of definitional hierarchy of personal servants, general domestic workers, drivers, field workers. This kind of hierarchy broke solidarity among them. Maintaining an elaborated hierarchy was intended to prevent possible collusion among and possible rebellions by the enslaved. For instance, the resentment between house servants who had the status of, quote unquote, a sort of black aristocracy and field hands was symbolically and materially enacted through consumption patterns. So the aristocrats, the black aristocrats, at, quote, at tables with plates, unquote, while the field hands, those that were lower at the on the hierarchy, were, quote, fed just like horses at a big, long wooden trough, unquote. And here you can see images how dehumanizing, how humiliating the experience of feeding was for or eating for African Americans when they were fed from pig troughs or from horses from huge troughs. So as reported by field slaves, quote from one of the slave narrative, the house servants put on more airs than the white folks, and they hold that they is up step better than the field niggers, unquote, sorry for the word. This fostered in house servants a sense of superiority and a sense of inferiority in field hands. So this animosity between domestic servants and other slaves was exacerbated with the former were given token privileges for spying on behalf of slave owners. They were encouraged and they were trained by planters to report every plot that they know of being formed or stealing anything on the plantation or running away. So snitchers were rightly perceived as traitors to their own people. In exchange for privileges from planters, some slave drivers were given the responsibility of rationing food for both slave quarters and the big house. Others, like in Salomon Northrop's narrative, distributed food among field slaves. So they felt that they belonged to a better class of enslaved Africans. Yet despite such conditioning, slaves would still bond in insubordination, which did not openly, quote, venture to contest the formal definitions of hierarchy and power, unquote, to quote a historian. This covert collective opposition took the form of sharing sensitive information about the planters on the grapevine. There was also cooperation between foremen and slaves while hunting for, smuggling and stealing food, trading either cultivated or stolen foods through, quote, the market chain as suppliers, resellers, and buyers, unquote. The act of cooking for and the act of feeding runaway slaves on the Underground Railroad under cover of the night assumed, quote, heightened emotional significance for the Black women involved, and when carried out in such subversive ways, political significance for such relations on plantation, unquote. Now, laziness, submissiveness, and docility, as captured in the stereotype of Sambo and Uncle Tom, were ascribed to enslaved African Americans, regardless of gender. Through coercive discipline, plantation masters and ladies of the house made efforts to render their chattel deferential, loyal, compliant, and self-effacing. In responding to unflattering stereotypical representations, everyday strategies of our existence that I'm discussing today took one or two contrasting rhetorical approaches. On the one hand, we've got enactment, or on the other hand, we've got transgression of the required code of behavior. Now, seeming accommodation to enslavement exemplifies covert insubordination, because performing stereotypical expectations had practical as well as subversive potential. In order to lighten the workloads, as Fox Genovese said, or get back at the mistress, house servants were perennially slow, to quote from Glimpse, or pretended not to understand instructions. That's information from another historian. Resistance may take the subtle form of feigned accommodation or that of open confrontation. So we've got transgression of servant etiquette, whether it was covered or overt, clearly demonstrates servant dismissal of cultural norms imposed by white society, which is yet another way of disputing imposed definitions. Now, refusal to perform household duties, as noted by Fox Genovese, may be seen as a strategic, a deliberate move, which would show limits and possibilities for enslaved Africans. So viewed as, if we look at this from this perspective, slowing or stopping housework registers both complaint and critique in a relatively risk-free way, except for possibility of provoking the master of mistress' transient ire. There were acts of culinary defiance as well, such as intentionally spoiling food. Ruining meals one is paid to prepare registers dissatisfaction with one's role. Certainly, I think it's true. So similarly, hatred of one's owner and possibly revenge for enslavement is frequently expressed in culinary acts of defilement. And one historian recounts the narrative of Aunt Delia, a former enslaved cook in North Carolina, who confessed to defiling food as a subversive act of sabotage. Quote, "How many times I spit in the biscuits and peed in the coffee just to get back at them, white folks," unquote. Now, slave owners also saw their dependents as infantile, primitive, and happy-go-lucky. And again, I'm quoting, I'm mentioning those stereotypes that were discussed by various historians. Now, since bondsmen allegedly could not take care of themselves, planters thought themselves thought that they needed to protect that chattel. So, for example, Lansford Lane, in his slave narrative, relates an interesting example of a mistress saving her house slaves from themselves, from actually their uncontrolled desires. Once she caught them stealing food from the kitchen, so she punished them for the fear of them succumbing to gluttony. So she actually saved them from the sin of gluttony. That's why she explained, justified her punishment, her punishing them. So this protection helped codify the racial hierarchy on plantations. So on the one hand, we've got slaves who were pretending to be satisfied with conditions on the plantations as a subversive tool on plantations. For the uninitiated, that might look as if they accepted the bondage. In reality, it was a strategy of resisting slavery, of camouflaging their feelings, because in this way, they dulled planters' vigilance. Okay, and on the other hand, we've got planters' obliviousness that allowed for collusion and concealment among bondsmen. Now, through various paternalistic acts, planters attempted to regulate slaves' conduct. And so with various plantation festivities, slave owners aimed at breaking slave solidarity through the promise of rewards for compliant slaves, or the threat of punishment for the unruly. Even in some cases, there were planters who canceled Christmas for slaves. Through these tactics, masters strove to create destructive competitiveness and foster disunity in their bondsmen. So ritual pleasantries and gratuities reminded slaves of oppressive paternalism, because plantation parties and celebrations, and particularly Christmas festivities, were intended to seem benevolent. They were supposed to inspire in slaves respect and gratitude or obedience to masters. They were also meant to create a periodic carnivalesque release of the frustration. So this is much like Mikhail Bakhtin's theory of grotesque, of carnival. So throughout the whole year, the slaves were supposed to obey their masters with the understanding that once a year they are given time to do whatever they want, drink and eat as much as they want. So so they were encouraged to, there was lots of feasting and frolicking and fiddling and lots of music. And even Frederick Douglass recalled that one of Christmas feasting was, quote, among the most effective means in the hands of slaveholders of keeping down the spirit of insurrection among the slaves, unquote, right? So with the promise of abundance of food, abundance of liquor, and lots of, music and fun, African slaves were kept in bondage. So despite this offer of temporary release of frustration through those various festivities, African slaves found ways to enjoy themselves outside of what one historian Camp called geography of containment. So this is beyond the purview of planters' gaze. Yeah, so here you've got this image. So slaves refused to accept spatial constraints imposed upon them in their free time. So they realized the oppressive paternalistic undertones of planters' parties, right? Because this is how that was the means of control. And they created their own world and moved their celebrations to rival geography, such as the woods or the swamps, which, quote, provided space for private and public creative expression, for rest and recreation, alternative communication, and importantly, resistance to planters' domination of slaves' every move, unquote. So organizing those illicit dance and outlaw parties required elaborate planning. So at the risk of flogging, women borrowed goods from their masters, while other, quote, knowing ones continued to plan the celebration, encouraging each other's high spirits with many a wink and a nod. So they were conspiring, that they were deriving pleasure from bonding while they were preparing those outlaw parties. Now, much like, as I mentioned earlier, Mikhail Bakhtin's concept of carnival. So here we've got those official parties and periodical festivities. One of those is corn shucking. And corn shucking, that was a mere show. So plantation festivities were meant to placate. However, they often fostered superficial appeasement. So under the guise of festive frolic, slaves conspired against the planters. So corn shuck songs attempted to lull planters and overseers into a false sense of security. They seem to be simple, happy-go-lucky songs, but in reality, they seem to be nonsensical, just melody for white men. But they actually contained, there were lots of spiritual references. There was information about the Underground Railroad. There was information about slave insurrection on plantations embedded, coded in those songs, which for white people, white planters and white overseers, seemed that they conveyed simply happy-go-lucky disposition of slaves who apparently were happy with their condition of being in bondage. Now, apart from the images that I mentioned earlier, the stereotypes that were circulating about white people, about the stereotypes about African slaves, apart from the laziness, apart from docility, primitivism, the enslaved were also deemed treacherous, and they were deemed intentionally deceitful. So most planters saw their bondsmen as, quote, unruly, savage, and immoral, unquote. And again, I'm quoting from historians here. The slaves' supposed degenerate nature made them, allegedly, especially prone to thievery. Planters believed that theft to the slave was slave's second nature. They also even came up with this, they also defined, quote, a thieving Negro simply as the one who stole much more than the average, unquote, and that's from Genevis. Masters blamed slaves' misappropriation of foodstuffs, not on insufficient, nutritionally insufficient rations, but on their dependents' wicked nature. So if bondsmen reputedly gained pleasure from defiant behaviors, then such an explanation clearly did not blemish planters' paternalistic, positive self-image, right? So there were no allegations of neglect, cruelty, and abuse. Simply, it was the African slaves' second nature. That's how they depicted thievery. So the enslaved also internalized that logic, and many slaves repeated after their masters, and it's on and on in slave narratives that thievery was, quote, just natural for Negroes to steal, unquote. Okay, so this was reappearing in various WPA narratives and various slave narratives. So in the sense, saying that, they shifted moral responsibility for stealing, for pilfering, from cruel, neglectful masters onto themselves. Okay. Another explanation, quote, when the enslaved stole, a bad master made them that way, unquote, was way more popular among enslaved than the enslavers. So petty thievery, and I mean here food theft in particular, was so common among slaves that its everydayness, quote, underwrote its power, unquote. So the system of rationing food and the practice of theft were interlocked in power relations. If rationing was a form of violence, says one historian, then the theft was a form of resistance, unquote. So compensating for nutritional deficiencies of the woefully insufficient, inadequate diet was one of the reasons the enslaved resorted to stealing their master's provisions. That was a license to theft for many. Sorry. Now, many slaves did not see taking food without permission as thievery, though, but rather as a survival strategy necessary for taking care of their own family under the exigencies of slavery. Charles Bell clarified in his narrative that, quote, the master might call it theft and brand it with the name of crime, but the slave reasoned differently. When he took a portion of his master's goods to satisfy his hunger, to keep himself warm, or to gratify his passion for luxurious enjoyment, unquote. And this is a quote from 1859 slave narrative. The act of taking and sharing food was not just a matter of acquiring sustenance. As I said, it is a weapon of the weak. And here we've got a wonderful quote, the top one. The master might call it theft and so this is the one I read, sorry. The enslaved employed two rhetorical strategies to reframe the act of pilfering. Firstly, they turned the notion of them being human property back on the slaveholders. So bondsmen explained that since a slave is property, not deemed a legal person, he cannot possibly be held accountable for stealing other property from the master. I was property, says one slave, not a man, not a father, not a husband. And the laws of property and self-interest, not of humanity and love, bore away. That was an explanation in Josiah Henson's slave narrative. Another respondent in the WPA interview said, I never call it stealing, I just call it taking. Now, additionally, if the slaveholder claimed ownership of the slave, in so doing, he deprived the slave of his legal personhood, right? Then the possessions of the slave automatically belong to the owner. So in this line of reasoning, if the slave were to take something from his or her master, with permission or not, that would not qualify as a theft. It would simply be redistribution of the master's property with no apparent loss. This is what Fox Genovese accounted in her narrative. And here we've got this quote: "What I take from my master being for my own use, who am his slave or property, he loses nothing by its transfer." This is what one slave declared. Many slaves shared Frederick Douglass's explanation that it was only a question of removal, that's the final quote, of removal, the taking of the planter's meat out of one tub and putting it into another. The ownership of the meat was not affected by the transaction. At first, he owned it in the tub. At last, he owned it in me. And you cannot deny logic to that. Secondly, one of the slaves announced that his master that he could take the food he worked for when he wanted, because the Bible says a man has a right to the sweat of his eyebrows. This moral sense of entitlement to the master's property riffs off in many slave narratives. For instance, Henry Bibb admitted, another quote, "I consider that I had a just right to what I took because it was the labor of my own hands. Should I take from a neighbor as a free man in a free country, I should consider myself guilty of doing wrong before God and man." Slaves' moral philosophy dictated that if they grew, cultivated, or produced food for their owners, the fruit of their labor was just as much theirs. Now, animalism is the final, I think, stereotypical depiction. This inconvertible animalism is the final stereotypical depiction of those of African descent that were circulating among white Southerners. By designating the black other as bestial, white Southerners justified segregation and subjugation of the black race. Among the strategies planters employed, as I mentioned earlier, the symbolically trying to erase humanity by culinary humiliation, eating from the troughs, as I mentioned, or this dehumanization was imposed at a very young age when children and adults alike were fed out of communal troughs like pigs with only oyster and clam shells as utensils, as noted in the narrative of Frederick Douglass or Langston Lane and dozen others. Such reduction of slave children to the status of an animal was a source of apparent amusement for planters. They were enjoying themselves, they were drinking and eating, enjoying the view of dehumanized African enslaved kids. Next, adult slaves had to dance or sing or recite to obtain bread or other provisions. Their subjectivity denied through those performative acts clearly was denied. This racist logic dictated that since slaves were degraded and ostensibly inured to such debased forms of amusement, they were unworthy of the humane treatment they were denied. The final interesting example that I'd like to mention is that African slaves would use also food to regain the humanity that was taken from them by forcing them to eat from the pig troughs. So even while committing heinous acts such as murder, and here there's a case of in South Carolina. Committing heinous act as murder, which is obviously affirming their bestiality in the eyes of white people. Some slaves use food as a rhetorical tool of restoring dignity and healing their humanity, let's say, they were deprived of. So before murdering Elizabeth Betsy Witherspoon in South Carolina, she was a widow, her house slaves indulged in her estate in a particular way, as recorded by Miss Mary Chestnut. First, quote, "They enjoyed a rare fine supper and a heap of laughing at the way they all look tomorrow, unquote, after which they beat and suffocated her. They would beat her and suffocate her. This festive meal eaten before the actual murder is clearly irrelevant with respect to moral judgment of the horrific crime, yet enjoying a celebratory meal with such civilized gadgets as tableware, as linen, eating from at the table, not from the trough, as opposed to using shells to scoop slops from troughs, served to restore not only their humanity, but dignity as well as human beings. So because there is a world of difference between wolfing down scraps from the kitchen and sharing breakfast with cows or pigs, as it was mentioned in some slave narratives, and dining at the table in the big house. The former defines one as a base animal, the latter obviously as a civilized human being. Now, I think I should finish off because I'm running out of time. I should probably mention as well the action of the instances when African slaves would poison or their masters, and this was, I think, one of the greatest fears of white masters in the South, that the black cooks would conspire against them and poison them. And actually, there were few cases because poison was much more common weapon than bullets in the South, actually. So just to conclude, the research presented today resonates with the shifting focus in the historiography of slavery that was defined by Theresa Singleton, who claims, quote, studies of slave foodways have moved away from nutrition to consider social and cultural factors that also influenced foodways of enslaved people, unquote. Analysis of food-related slave resistance illustrates the critical importance of such research by demonstrating how enslaved used food as everyday strategy of resistance to planters' oppressive rule. Slave narratives gave plentiful descriptions of slave defiance through enactment and transgression of stereotypical depictions of them as the other race. Aware that direct confrontation with the white oppressor could lead to merciless retribution, the enslaved, through acts of modifying work ethic, gardening, pilfering food, organizing secret parties, they sought to ease the chokehold of chattel slavery rather than instantly overthrow it altogether. As one historian remarks, the powerless, regardless of whether they were peasants or slaves, were, quote, concerned largely with immediate de facto gains in their daily struggles, putting the systematic and cumulative resistance of political or military revolt to a back burner. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Urszula. If you could stop sharing, thank you.
Yes.
And we're going to move to our question and answer.